The party was in full swing at the big, beautiful house. It belonged to a man who loved art and music, and he often invited people over. That night, the rooms were filled with the sound of laughter and talking. There were important critics, famous musicians from the city orchestra, and talented young students from the music college. They all stood in small groups, holding glasses of wine, talking about important things and famous people. They knew Dot in the middle of all this color and noise was a woman who seemed out of place. She was invited by her friend, a lively woman who loved being the center of attention. The friend was wearing a bright red dress and talking loudly. But her guest, the librarian, was dressed in a simple, soft blue dress. It was nice, but it didn't shine like the others. She stayed close to her friend, but she was quiet. Her eyes, a kind of gentle gray, watched everything. They didn't look eager or jealous, just thoughtful. Mostly, her eyes kept going back to one thing in the corner of the grand room, the piano. It was a huge, sleek black grand piano, its lid open like a giant wing. It was the king of the room. Sometimes, when the noise was loudest, her gaze would drift over to it and just rest there for a long moment. You could almost see her mind was somewhere else, far away from the party. Her friend noticed this. She liked to have fun, and she loved her quiet friend, but sometimes she didn't understand her. She wanted to bring her into the conversation. So, when a group of young musicians stood nearby talking about a very difficult piece they were learning, the friend saw her chance. "Oh, you're talking about piano," she said, her voice bright and carrying. She pulled the librarian a little closer to the group. "My friend here knows about the piano. She took lessons for years when she was a girl. Didn't you?" The librarian gave a small, tight smile. It was the kind of smile you use when you want to be polite. "A very long time ago," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the room's buzz. "I hardly remember." The young musicians, a man and a woman dressed in stylish black, were polite. They smiled at her. But it was a professional smile, the kind you give to someone's nice but uninteresting aunt. The young man nodded. "It's a wonderful hobby," he said. His tone was kind, but it was the kind of kindness that comes from feeling above someone. It was clear he thought of the piano as his life's work, not a childhood hobby. The group's conversation moved back to themselves, to their teachers, and their upcoming performances. The librarian's friend got pulled into a different chat, and she was left alone again, standing by a large potted plant. From this spot, she could see the piano clearly. A few minutes later, as she was slowly sipping her water, she heard it. The two young musicians had walked a few steps away, thinking they were out of earshot. Their voices were low, but the words carried in a sudden lull of the party noise. Probably mastered Twinkle. "Twinkle, little star," the young woman said with a light laugh. "Well, we all have to start somewhere," her companion replied, and their laughter mixed together. Soft and private, the words didn't hit her like an insult. They didn't make her angry. Instead, they made her feel very tired and very old. A deep, familiar sadness, one she had carried for decades, settled in her chest. It was the feeling of being a ghost in a room full of living people. She looked at her own hands, resting by her side. They were ordinary hands, with short, neat nails. There were no signs on them of the years they had spent flying across ivory keys, of the music they had once held. They were just a librarian's hands, good for turning pages and typing quietly. She wished, more than anything, to be back in her small, cozy apartment, with her cat and her books. The noise of the party felt heavy on her skin. She watched the other guests. She saw a famous violinist holding court, his gestures wide. She saw the host, a large man with a booming laugh, patting people on the back. Everyone seemed so sure of their place in the world. She felt like a piece of furniture, something that was just there, barely noticed. Her friend swooped back over, her energy unchanged. "Having fun? Isn't this exciting?" she asked, her eyes sparkling. "It's very nice," the librarian answered, and it was the truth. The house was beautiful. The people were glamorous. It was just a world that was no longer hers, if it ever had been. She was there as an observer, a quiet shadow in the corner of a bright painting. And as the evening moved forward, she had no idea that the spotlight, so far away from her, was slowly, inevitably, beginning to turn in her direction, that the mood of the party had shifted. The polite, sophisticated chatter was now looser and louder. The host, a large man with a voice that filled a room, had finished another glass of wine and was feeling inspired. He clapped his hands together, a sharp sound that cut through the noise. "Friends, wonderful friends," he boomed, his face glowing with happiness. "We have such talent in this room. All this talk of music is making my heart sing. Who will give us a performance? Who will bless our ears?" A confident young man, one of the music students from earlier, stepped forward almost immediately. He gave a little bow, a practiced smile on his face. "I would be honored," he said. He sat at the grand piano and played a fast, flashy piece. It was full of notes that tumbled over each other like a waterfall. It was impressive. Everyone clapped warmly. The young man stood up, accepting the praise with another nod. Then a woman, a professional cellist who was friends with the host, played a somber, beautiful solo. The rich, deep notes of her cello filled the room with a different kind of feeling, sad and lovely. The applause was even warmer for her. Each performance made the librarian, still standing by her plant, shrink a little more into herself. It wasn't that the music was bad. It was very good. But it was like watching people speak a language she had forgotten how to use. Her fingers, resting at her side, twitched just once, a tiny, secret movement against the fabric of her dress. Her friend, meanwhile, was having the time of her life. She loved drama and surprise. With each performance, she got a mischievous glint in her eye. She nudged the librarian with her elbow. "See? Everyone is doing it. It's just for fun," she whispered, but her whisper was not very quiet. "No, really, I couldn't," the librarian whispered back, her face growing warm. "Please don't ask me to." But her friend was not listening. She was caught in the idea, the funny little scene she was picturing in her head. Her sweet, bookish friend, playing a simple, childish tune. It would be a charming moment, a little human break from all the serious talent. It would be a good story to tell later. When the cellist finished, there was a happy pause. The host was about to speak again when the librarian's friend suddenly raised her voice. "My friend will play next." The words hung in the air. All heads turned to look at the two women by the plant. The librarian felt every single pair of eyes land on her. It was like a physical weight. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. She shook her head, a quick, desperate movement. "Oh, no." "Please," she said, her voice a thin thread of sound. But the idea, once planted in the party's mind, took root. The host, always eager for entertainment, beamed. "Wonderful. The more, the merrier. Come, don't be shy." His encouragement was kind, but it felt like a command. A few other guests, thinking they were being supportive, joined in. "Yes, give it a try." One called out, "We don't judge here," said another with a friendly laugh. But their kindness was worse than silence. It was a confirmation of their low expectations. They were cheering for her the way you cheer for a small child who is about to sing a nursery rhyme. The two young musicians from earlier shared a look. It wasn't mean, exactly. It was a look of amusement and mild embarrassment for her. A path cleared between her and the piano. It felt like a mile long. The gleaming black wood of the instrument, seemed to gleam under the lights, waiting. It looked like a giant sleeping beast. Her friend was still smiling, giving her an encouraging push from behind. "Go on, it'll be fun." For a moment, the librarian considered just turning and walking out of the room. But that would cause a bigger scene. It would be rude to the host, who had been kind in inviting her. It would embarrass her friend terribly. She was trapped. The walls of the room seemed to close in. The noise of the party became a dull roar in her ears. She took a deep, shaky breath. The only way out was through. If she played something very short and very simple, it would be over in a minute. Then the real musicians could continue, and everyone would forget about it. With her eyes fixed on the floor, she took a step, then another. Her walk to the piano was slow and quiet. The friendly smiles and encouraging nods from the guests felt like pinpricks on her skin. She could feel their pity. She could feel their curiosity. She was a small, strange curiosity in their elegant evening. Finally, she reached the piano bench. It felt cold. She smoothed her simple blue dress underneath her as she sat down. She kept her eyes down, looking at her own hands as she placed them in her lap. The crowd had grown quiet again, but this was a different quiet than before. It was a waiting, patient quiet, full of polite expectation for something small and sweet. The librarian stared at the keys. They were a blur of black and white. For a terrifying second, her mind went completely empty. She couldn't remember a single note, not even the simple tune she had planned to play. Panic rose in her throat. This was a mistake. This was a terrible, horrible mistake. She closed her eyes tightly, blocking out the room, the people, the lights. She tried to find one note, just one to start with. And in that darkness behind her eyelids, far away from the party, she heard something else. Not the silence of the room, but the echo of a different sound from a long, long time ago. It was the sound of an orchestra tuning, the rustle of a crowded concert hall, the frantic beating of a young girl's heart. She didn't decide to play it. It simply rose up inside her, a wave that had been held back for 30 years. Her spine straightened. Her shoulders, which had been hunched in fear, settled. She lifted her hands, and they no longer felt like the hands of a nervous guest. They hovered above the keys, poised and still. And then she began. The first sound she made was not a melody. It was not a simple, hesitant note. It was something deep and solid and dark, a low, resonant chord that seemed to come not just from the piano, but from the very floor of the house. It was a sound that had weight. It hung in the air of the grand room, silencing the last few whispers that had lingered near the back. The polite, expectant smiles on some faces froze for a second. That wasn't the right sound. That wasn't the beginning of a simple song. Her hands, which had seemed so ordinary, came down again. And this time, they began to move. It started slowly, a series of deep, questioning notes, like a heart beginning to beat after a long sleep. There was a sorrow in it, a deep and lonely searching. But within that sorrow was a terrible strength. The music was not pretty. It was not charming. It was powerful, and it was real. The two young musicians near the front were the first to truly understand. Their heads, which had been tilted in mild curiosity, snapped up straight. Their eyes, which had held amusement, went wide. They knew this music. They had studied it, struggled with it, dreamed of being able to play it. It was Rachmaninoff, one of the most difficult, most emotionally powerful pieces ever written for piano. And this quiet woman in the simple dress was not just playing it. She was pulling it out of the instrument with a force that was physical. She was no longer looking at her hands. Her eyes were still closed, but her face had changed completely. The expression of shy fear was gone. In its place was a look of deep, almost painful focus. Her brow was furrowed, not in struggle, but in concentration. There was a tension in her jaw. She was somewhere else. She was not in a party. She was in a storm of her own making. The music began to climb. The left hand built a foundation of deep, rolling waves of sound. The right hand swept over the top, not with tinkling lightness, but with a soaring, crying melody. It was huge. It filled every corner of the room, pushing against the walls, shaking the crystals in the chandelier. It was not something you just listened to. It was something you felt in your chest. The host stood perfectly still, his glass of wine forgotten in his hand. His mouth was slightly open. The cellist had brought a hand to her own chest, her fingers pressed over her heart. The librarian's friend had taken a step back, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with shock that was quickly turning into something else. Kind of awe, but it was the young man who had played first, the one with the flashy piece, whose reaction was most clear. All the confident ease had drained from his face. He looked pale. He was a student of the piano. He knew what his own hands could do, and he knew with absolute certainty that they could not do this. This was not just playing. This was speaking a language he was still learning, with a fluency that seemed impossible. He watched her hands, they were a blur, yet every movement was precise and powerful. He saw the strength in her wrists, the control in her fingers that he had completely missed before. The piece built and built. There were moments of furious crashing sound, where her whole body moved with the effort, her shoulders driving the power into the keys. Then, suddenly, it would collapse into a passage of such delicate, heartbreaking sadness that several people in the room felt their own eyes sting. She would lean into the piano for these quiet parts, her face softening, the music becoming a fragile, whispered confession that no one moved. No one coughed. No one even seemed to breathe too loudly. The earlier feeling of a party was gone. This was not entertainment anymore. This was a witnessing. They were all, every single one of them, intruders on a private moment that was somehow spilling out in front of them. The woman they had pitied, who they had smiled at with gentle condescension, had vanished. In her place was a musician, a true artist, and the music was telling a story of loss and longing and a beauty that was almost too painful to bear. She played for what felt like both an instant and an eternity. Time in the room had stopped, measured only by the rise and fall of the music. The guests were prisoners to it, caught in the spell she was weaving. Every note was a surprise, a gift, a rebuke. The earlier laughter about "Twinkle, twinkle" now felt like a distant, shameful memory from another lifetime. In the final moments, the music returned to that deep, sorrowful searching of the beginning. But it was different now. It was not a question, but a memory. The powerful chords softened, becoming echoes of themselves. She played the last few notes, each one placed with a tenderness that was like laying something precious down to rest. The final note, a single low tone, faded into the silent, stunned air. And then it was over. Her hands fell from the keys and settled back into her lap. The great, powerful energy that had filled her seemed to leave all at once. Her shoulders slumped forward, just a little. She let out a slow, soft breath, as if she had been holding it for 30 years. She opened her eyes. For a moment, she looked confused, as if she didn't know where she was. She blinked, looking down at the piano keys, then slowly, she turned her head to look at the room. She saw the faces. The shock, the awe, the tears on some cheeks. And in that moment, she looked more vulnerable than she had all night. The artist was gone, and the modest woman had returned, but she was returning to a room that had been changed forever. The silence was complete, deeper than any silence that had come before it. They were all waiting, but for what? They did not know. The silence after the final note was not empty. It was thick, packed with the weight of what everyone had just heard. It lasted for 3 seconds, maybe 4. It was broken by a single person starting to clap dot. It was the cellist. She was not applauding politely. She brought her hands together with a firm, loud crack that echoed in the room. Her face was wet with tears she hadn't even felt fall. That one clap was like a signal. Then the host let out a wordless shout of "Bravo!" and the dam broke. The room exploded into sound. But it wasn't just applause. It was a roar. People jumped to their feet, their chairs scraping loudly on the floor. The applause was thunderous, wild, not the careful clapping from earlier in the evening. People were whistling. Some were still crying. They were looking at each other with wide eyes, as if to say, "Did you see that? Did you hear that?" The librarian sat perfectly still on the piano bench, caught in the eye of this hurricane of noise. The color rose in her cheeks, a deep, hot blush of confusion and overwhelm. She looked small again, dwarfed by the giant piano and the roaring crowd. She gave a slight, uncertain shake of her head, as if trying to deny what was happening. The host was the first to reach her. He rushed over, his face glowing with excitement. He took her hand, not to shake it, but to hold it between both of his own. my dear woman," he stammered, his booming voice now trembling with emotion. "That was? I have no words. That was a masterpiece. Why have you hidden this from the world?" The question hung in the air, and others pressed closer, wanting to hear the answer. The crowd's noise settled into a buzzing, eager quiet. All eyes were on her. She gently pulled her hand back, folding her hands in her lap again. She looked down at them, those ordinary hands that had just performed magic. When she spoke, her voice was quiet. The room leaned in to hear. I haven't played like that in a very long time," she said. "It was a struggle to find the words. Not since I was a girl. But you played like a virtuoso." The host exclaimed. "You must have studied for years. Who was your teacher?" She nodded slowly. "I did, from the time I was 4. She took a shaky breath. "I was what they called a prodigy." The word felt strange in her mouth, a relic from another life. A murmur went through the crowd. The young male pianist felt his stomach drop. A prodigy. It made a terrible, perfect sense. "I played concerts," she continued, her voice gaining a little strength, but also a distant sadness. "Big halls, with orchestras. It was all I did. It was all I was supposed to be." She paused, remembering. The practice was endless. 8 hours a day. Every day. My teachers were strict. My parents were proud, but they were also nervous. Every note had to be perfect. Every performance had to be better than the last. The piano stopped being music. It became a machine. A machine I had to operate perfectly. She looked up, not at any one person, but at the grand piano in front of her. I was 17. I finished a competition. I won first prize. Everyone was celebrating, hugging me, telling me my future was golden. Her voice dropped to a whisper, and all I felt was empty, completely empty, and tired, so tired my bones ached. I looked at the piano and I felt nothing. No love, no joy, just a heavy, cold dread. The room was utterly silent now. You could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator from the distant kitchen. "So I stopped," she said simply. "I told my parents I would not play another note. Not ever again." They were heartbroken. They thought it was a phase. But I meant it. I sold my piano. I went to university for literature. I became a librarian. I found peace in the quiet, in the stories written by other people. She gave a small, sad smile. For 30 years, I have not touched a piano. Until tonight. Her friend, who had pushed her to play, was sobbing quietly, her face buried in her hands. She felt a deep, crushing guilt, but also a bewildered wonder. The young female music student spoke up, her voice full of awe and curiosity. But how? How could you still play like that after so long? The librarian thought about it. I don't know, she said honestly. When I sat down, I was so frightened. I wanted to play something simple, but my mind went blank. And then, it was like the music was just there, waiting. It wasn't in my fingers, exactly. It was deeper. In here. She placed a hand over her heart. I didn't think about the notes. I just remembered how it felt. The feeling of it. Not the pressure to be perfect. Just the storm inside it. The sadness and the hope all mixed together. For the first time, I wasn't playing it for a judge or a critic or to win. I was just letting it out. She looked around at the faces staring back at her faces that now held only respect, wonder, and a deep humility. Tonight, she said softly, I think I remembered why I loved it once. Before all the other stuff got in the way. The host was crying openly now, large tears rolling into his beard. He looked at this modest, gentle woman and saw not a failed prodigy, but someone who had found a deeper kind of courage. The courage to walk away, and the unexpected courage to return, just for a moment, on her own terms. He didn't ask her to play again. He didn't offer her a concert series. He understood that would be the same old pressure. Instead, he simply bowed his head to her, a deep, respectful bow from a man who knew he had been in the presence of something truly rare. It wasn't just talent he was honoring. It was the human story behind it. The spell was broken, but the room was changed. The air was clearer. The conversations that started up again were hushed, thoughtful. People looked at her not with pity, but with a kind of reverence. They had come for a party, but they had witnessed a resurrection. And the quiet woman at the center of it all just wished, more than anything, for a cup of tea and the familiar, forgiving silence of her library dot. The respectful silence that followed her story did not last long. It was quickly filled with a soft, buzzing hum of whispered conversation. But the tone was entirely different now. The earlier noise had been bright and sharp, full of gossip and performance. This new sound was lower, warmer, full of words like astonishing, humbling, and I've never heard anything like it. People did not crowd around her all at once. They seemed to understand, instinctively, that she needed space. They approached slowly, one or two at a time, like people approaching a quiet altar in a church. The first was the cellist. She knelt down beside the piano bench so she would not be standing over the seated woman. Her eyes were still red. Thank you, she said, her voice thick. Thank you for sharing your gift with us. And thank you for sharing your truth. It changes how I hear music. She reached out and gently squeezed the librarian's hand, then stood and moved away. The two young musicians came next. They stood before her, looking more like nervous students than the confident artists they had been earlier in the evening. The young man cleared his throat. Ma'am, he began, the title respectful and earnest. We owe you an apology. Our behavior earlier was ignorant and unkind. The librarian shook her head quickly. No, please. It's all right. You had no way of knowing. That's just it, the young woman said, her voice full of emotion. We should have. We should never assume. You have given us more than a performance tonight. You have given us a lesson. They both nodded deeply to her before stepping back. Their earlier arrogance completely washed away, replaced by a new and sober understanding of what being a musician could truly mean. Her friend finally made her way through. Her face was a mess of smudged makeup and tears. She didn't say anything at first. She just wrapped her arms around the librarian and held her tightly for a long moment. "I am so, so sorry," she whispered into her friend's shoulder, her voice cracking. "I was so stupid. I was just trying to be funny. I never meant to—" "She," the librarian whispered, patting her friend's back. "It's okay. It's over. And in a strange way, it was good. It needed to happen." And she realized, as she said it, that it was true. A heavy door inside her, locked for decades, had been blown open. The host had been busy. He returned not with more questions, but with a steaming cup of tea on a small saucer. He presented it to her with great care. "I thought you might like this," he said gently. "It's chamomile. Very calming." It was the kindest thing he could have done. He didn't offer champagne. He offered a quiet moment. She took the cup with a grateful smile, her hands warming around the porcelain. The simple, familiar act of holding the tea felt grounding. It was a tiny piece of her normal world, in this suddenly surreal one dot as she sipped her tea. The party began to reform around her, but it orbited her like a gentle planet. People talked, but they glanced her way with soft smiles. They spoke of her performance in hushed, reverent tones. The story of the prodigy who had quit and returned, even for just one piece, spread through the room like a beautiful, sad legend dot. After about 20 minutes, she set the empty cup down on the saucer. She caught her friend's eye and gave a small, tired smile. She nodded slightly towards the door. Her friend understood immediately. She came over, linked her arm through the librarian's, and began to gently guide her through the crowd. Their path to the front door was slow. Every few steps, someone would stop them. Not to ask for more, but simply to offer a final word. "Thank you," an older gentleman said, his hand over his heart. "You have a beautiful soul." A woman murmured. The host met them at the grand entrance. He took both of her hands in his again. "You have honored my home beyond measure," he said sincerely. "My door is always open to you. Not to perform, just as a friend. To have tea." She nodded, knowing he meant it. The cool night air outside was a shock, but a welcome one. It smelled of damp earth and distant rain, clean and real. Her friend helped her into the car, then got in the driver's side. For a few minutes, they drove in silence through the dark, tree-lined streets. The only sound was the hum of the engine. Finally, her friend spoke, her eyes on the road. "Will you ever play again?" she asked, her voice timid. The librarian looked out the window at the passing shadows of houses, each with its own hidden stories. She thought about the feeling of the keys under her fingers. Not the fear, but the moment when the music took over. The feeling of release. "I don't know," she said, and it was the honest answer. "Maybe. But if I do, it will be for me. Late at night, with the windows closed. Or maybe on a quiet afternoon, just because I feel like hearing a certain sound." She turned to her friend. "It will never again be for a crowd. Tonight was an exception, a necessary one." Her friend nodded, understanding dawning on her face. "It was like you were finally saying goodbye to it. Or maybe hello again, on your own terms." "Yes," the librarian whispered. "Exactly that." When they arrived at her small apartment building, her friend walked her to the door. "Do you want me to come up?" she asked. "No," the librarian said, giving her a genuine, warm smile. The first truly easy smile of the night. "I'm all right. I just need some quiet." Inside her apartment, it was dark and still. Her cat padded over and wound itself around her legs, purring. She turned on a single lamp, its light soft and yellow. She did not go to her bookshelf. She walked over to the small, clear space by the window where a piece of furniture had once sat long ago. She stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet. Then, very softly, she began to hum. It was the main melody from the Rachmaninoff, the soaring, crying theme. It was just a breath of a tune, almost silent. But it was there. In her quiet living room, with only her cat to hear, the music was still alive. Not as a performance, but as a memory. Not as a burden, but as a part of her story that she had finally made peace with. She had been mocked at first. Then she had stunned the crowd. But in the end, the most important thing was that she had finally, after 30 long years, stunned herself back into her own life.